Hello again. This is Rob Womack, and I'm the author of this little book, Jubilee, the Emancipation of Life and Love. And I'm here today to read to you the 6th chapter of the book. I appreciate you being here. I hope you'll like it. Many have said that this is their favorite chapter of the book. It, like all the other chapters, opens with an epigraph, this one by Richard Hilkin from the Quaker Book of Faith and Practice. This was written in 1992 or 93. We need to see the problem of homelessness as only one end of the spectrum of evil that has the massive subsidies to owners at the other. It is a problem that will be as difficult and painful to solve as slavery. Slavery as an evil shared many of the qualities of the present housing situation. It benefited the wealthy, created an underclass, and denied them human rights. The solution was painful, for abolition often required that slave owners abandon their investment with no recompense. To change our attitudes to housing will be no less of a challenge to us than slavery was for the reformers. Not only because institutional evil is hard to recognize, but also because so many of us benefit personally from the present situation. Chapter 6, The Days of Sabbath. Here, now, we have finally arrived. Our destination lies before us. It is nearly midnight on something like the 31st of December of the 99th increment of time. Our greatest great-grandparent eagerly dances on the cusp of a long-awaited celebration, a centennial some call Jubilee. We live through the long moment just before midnight. This moment, where we have met, where we reside, is known by many names. To some, it is the present. For others, eternity. Two linguistic symbols representing one reality. This is to be forever and always, an eternal time of expectant anticipation, sweet longing, and sublime joy. Though we live as if in exile far from home, from this one reality we can never roam. In spite of the apparent separations, each contrived within the human mind, we are all in fact one. Elders, neighbors, siblings, kin, us, the web of life and love. Little more need be said of the places from where we diverged. Suffice it to say, the places where we have been led are stark disappointments. One point is certain, possibly three. First, the past is utterly complete. It remains immutable. With us here and now, past and present are inseparably contiguous. Second, the roadmap of our history, the breadth and depth of its complexity, is impossible to fully comprehend. As a result, our mental maps are intrinsically incomplete. From our current vantage point, somewhat oblique. The general contours are visible, though shrouded in memory's mist. While a shared history connects us all, no two are alike. As with life and love, so it is with paradox, replete. For reasons by now quite easily understood, Euro-Americans adopted a story based more on personal preference than honest humility. Our history, blurred by collective self-centeredness, modified by shame, lacks forthright integrity. Fortunately, the story, as it unfolds, is perpetually incomplete. The opportunity still remains to remember our way home. The Jubilee, long underway and well overdue, awaits our arrival patiently. Third, unlike the past, its nearest cousin, the future, remains forever out of reach. by definition, it is continuously beyond the realm of first-hand experience. Any possible descriptions, therefore, are little more than myth or fantasy. Whether fictive tale, magical dream, or dire forecast, the future exists only within the human imagination. What takes place between its margins is forever undetermined. A useful concept the future may be, to arrange plans and prepare for movements towards safety, health, and peaceful contentment, a wholeness once translated as shalom. But only the perpetual present, nestled between past and future, emerges in actuality. Only the present is felt, witnessed, and experienced. With each decision, each interaction, each moment, a new creation arises to shape the divots and contours of one present, eternal reality, to sow the seedbed of our ever-growing history, and to plot the trajectory forward. Our shared experience could be guided by the principles conveyed from our greatest great-grandparent, to harmonize with the web of life and love, to live safely within the processes of homeostasis, to give to the best of our ability in our care and work, and to limit our consumption of the material and energy freely given to be equally shared by all. Instead, rather than to migrate, integrate, and protect, our ancestors and their offspring chose to colonize, dominate, and defend. The ramifications of their methods have left us ill-prepared to accept the standing invitation to rejoin the Jubilee, if ever we decide to make our way there, that is. In the present eternity, innumerable beings quietly seek a way home to join the Jubilee. Somewhere, one attempts to transcribe a message, a whispered echo pulsing through the universe across the wholeness of time. Elsewhere, a person takes a seat, retrieves a book, reads of old sorrows and new possibilities. Somewhere else, someone leans away from their desk, alone, exhausted, unhappy in life as well as in work. They often wonder, what am I doing here? Is this really it? At home, upon their bedside table, the same book, one among many, all unread. Next door, in a deep malaise, someone has bought a ticket, seeking an escape in blithe entertainment. Nearby, someone watches the news while savoring dessert. Immersed in the screen, they feel slightly sickened. So much violence, so much poverty. In the next town over, while taking out the trash, someone worries anxiously about the environment. Though the issues seem unrelated, most Euro-Americans ask the same question. What can only one person like me do? Again, the error was baked into the question. Answers went unoffered. None knew of the others, yet the question implied a hope. Someone, somewhere, must share their concerns. Though they knew not by whom, nor what to do, all knew something must be done. Then, one night, by the fireside, a couple broke the silence. They began to reflect. Married for several years, finally considering children, both willingly acknowledged the pervasive unhappiness in the relationship and their work. After children, time together would be more sparse. To friends, they often said money did not drive them. What was left unsaid was how time, work, and money factored so heavily into most of their decisions. Money was at the root of most of their disagreements, the source of much of their stress. In the precious time off, they tried to thread a needle. Before the real world closed in again, they would find some quality time together. during which they earnestly pledged to avoid any topic which might lead to conflicts or discomfort. Voluntarily silenced for such a long time, they had remained trapped in an inherited predicament. They still had hope, however, if not the freedom, to do some good in the world. Maybe someday one would leave the lucrative private sector and work for a small nonprofit. Or they would make their first million, retire early, and turn their attention to helping others. If they had the chance, they hoped to find a more meaningful purpose for their lives. By the bonfire that very night, together they decided, for the sake of their marriage, for the sake of their life, they would begin a routine Sabbath, a day of rest from commerce. One day each week, neither would earn nor spend. In addition, they opted out of attending spaces where earning or spending occurred. Instead, they held Sabbath together in the garden. They ate lunch on blankets in mild repose. They shared relaxed conversations about their hopes. They struggled with their fears. They laughed. They made love. They delighted in each other's presence. They met each other again for the first time all over again. I'll do that one again. They met each other for the first time all over again. In the weeks and months ahead, over dinners with close friends, the couple shared their Sabbath experiences. Around the Feast of Ideas, the friends were encouraged and inspired. They took the initiative to practice a weekly Sabbath of their own. Everyone agreed to opt out of commerce to avoid the acts of earning and spending, but each practiced Sabbath slightly differently. They started simply to see what each might learn. Freedom exercised open hearts and minds to think with expansive creativity. As they did, perceptions of the world seemed to alter. For example, the physician told of their neighbor who had described the stress of illness along with the misery of their job. Their spouse was ill, needed doctors, and in-home care they could not afford. The neighbor could neither resign nor care for their spouse because the employer paid for both the health insurance and the desperately needed income. The ailing couple dangled between options irreconcilable. Just that morning, the physician recalled they were involved in an argument of intense concern. The physician and their spouse vehemently disagreed about where to take their next vacation, relax at the beach house, or embark on an adventure abroad. A realization suddenly dawned. The beach house, the trip abroad, and the time off had all been paid for by the insurance company, the employer, the neighbor, and their customers, while the ill spouse suffered at home alone. While the physician spoke, the real estate broker had a realization as well. When the physician concluded, they shared the story of their nephew who was couch surfing in the home of a friend. That is, of course, when the nephew wasn't under the roof of one of their divorced parents, the broker's closest kin. The broker had realized the recent purchase of a third rental property was 3 more than the nephew could afford. The professor quietly sipped a beverage, attentively listening. The nephew could not afford rent or save a down payment due to 4 years of college loans. The loan provider had transferred money to the university to directly deposit in the professor's monthly salary. With funds the nephew had borrowed, the professor had made a handsome down payment on a gem of a property. While the nephew slept on someone's couch, the professor reviewed blueprints of their future dream home. As others spoke, the banker noticed a disturbing pattern. In times past, people worked to earn before they spent. More recently, however, many people had to borrow, then work to pay back what was lent. credit cards, car loans, education loans, medical bills, and mortgages, if they were so fortunate, not to mention taxes for interest on government debt, had been paid for necessities. Due to the rise in inequality, more money was available for loans from overstuffed accounts of banks' depositors than from income earned in an employee's wages. At one time, the banker recalled, Euro-Americans had sought raises and grumbled when the increase was small. Now, however, they sought interest rates they might afford and celebrated when the loss of income was low. For those who had to work and borrow, the trends were alarming. For bankers, depositors, and employers, they were nothing less than charming. For the friends who gathered to practice the days of Sabbath, the stars suddenly aligned, the dots all connected. The troubles had landed terribly close to home. The time had come to diverge from the corrupted, masculine, colonizing ways of Economicus and the Euro-Americans. One evening, someone asked a question no one could rescind. What are we going to do about your nephew, the neighbor's spouse, and all the others like them? What's more, what will we do about ourselves? Historically, Euro-Americans had defined who was like them far too narrowly. Everyone was deeply concerned, of course, about the misery of persons of color, black, brown, and indigenous, the poor and the incarcerated, migrants and refugees. Up until then, inequality, housing, public education, and health care had been issues to debate, on occasion, in the abstract, privately, among friends. Under precise conditions, pity might escalate to protest. For a time, the issues were taken quite seriously, as one adopts a hobby or a fad. Sadly, as happens far too often, hobbies are easily dropped and soon forgotten. As a result, when the most immediate troubles ceased, neighbors unlike them were cast adrift, each to his own, as the saying went. More pleasure, comfort, and rest were derived from nostalgic memories than the long-term causes of peace and healing the suffering of inequality. Ultimately, luxury and superiority, self-worth and self-esteem were prioritized over compassion and remedy. It was as if the ancestors and their offspring had to leave the suffering of others visibly in place in order to feel good, or at least better, about themselves. During the Friends' Sabbath gatherings, another realization became clear. The friends who were more financially well off had numerous more options, more freedom of choice, but far less courage than their less fortunate peers. Over dilemmas of what to sacrifice, they wrestled ceaselessly. A tacky self-image of a privileged status was as difficult to release as an adopted identity. Like any active addiction, when the drug of choice is readily supplied, trouble seems so far away. Yet to reach the other side of healing, the struggle is invariably worthwhile. Unsurprisingly, the sacrifices of privilege, identity, self-image, or addiction for a few were simply too much to bear. To the faux forms of comfort and entertainment they wistfully retired. Like their ancestors before them, they quietly disappeared. Fortunately, many in the group were propelled forward by all they had gained. Those with less wealth more easily discovered the middle path to serve and live generously. They no longer felt exhausted or oppressed. There was less frustration and resentment, less scorn, envy, and pain. Routine encounters became like unique adventures abroad. Their spirits felt freer. They laughed more easily. They wept without shame. They found within them a peace, trust, and courage to carry on each and every day. They were savoring a foretaste of the joy of Jubilee. At one Sabbath dinner, the friends grew ever more adventurous. Someone proposed a challenge, possibly the physician. What was said no one would forget. First, a bold proclamation, "Heal thyself!" But what came next evoked a hearty yawn. "I have lowered my expenses." So steeped in profit-taking, this hardly seemed radical at all. Then, following the pregnant pause, "In order to lower my income and more freely offer my gifts, talents, and care." In stunned silence, ears perked up to listen more intently. This is a quote. Material, energy, and work had been freely given to be equally shared by everyone. Who am I to deny care to many and to others sell it for selfish gain? Close quote. During the days of Sabbath, they realized the high cost of health care, onerous for the healthy, ruinous for the ill, was the direct result of above average salaries of employees like them throughout the field. The broker had been quietly contemplating something much the same. Plans were in the works to lower their expenses and own but one home, their primary residence. Never to be outdone, and with the gauntlet raised, they decided to up the ante. Forthwith the broker exclaimed, "My rental homes I'll put up for sale." Another collective yawn. "As far below the market rate as I can bear." Close quote. The nephew and others like them could finally afford a home of their own and pay off their student loans. They might also land a decent job and hang something beautiful on their bedroom walls. The professor of economics listened closely. They knew these actions would never be enough. Money was a concept, abstract and inert, in its essence, impotent. The non-action of not spending and not consuming was indeed a tremendous help to lessen the material mined, trees harvested, land destroyed, fuel burned, and pollution to dispose. Furthermore, in their Sabbath practice, they had noticed something else. If the gasoline and electricity burned and the wasted food were dramatically reduced, the natural processes of the rooted ones would graciously replenish the atmosphere. So the professor spoke up. They asked if the friends could elevate their gain. Would they also monitor the electricity and gasoline they burned, the wasted food, meat consumed, and miles traveled by air, to lower them as well? In unison, with a full-throated, wholehearted yes, the challenge was accepted. The friends knew they were finally on to something meaningful. The friends of the Sabbath gathering developed cohesive bonds and an ease with mutual support. Each person worked at their own pace and in their own ways, but all moved in one direction. New habits developed to carry on for weeks, months, and eventually generations. At times it seemed so easy, frankly, that they grew a little bored. Seeing how far the race was yet to run, some decided a new challenge must be in store. In the discussions, they debated what constituted life-giving work. What basic forms of interdependence could we not live without? Good, life-giving, necessary work they sorted into 5 broad categories. There were first-hand providers and secondary suppliers of nourishment, protection, information, healing, and restoration. In the first category were farmers, plumbers, cooks, and the like, those who grew, distributed, prepared, and preserved healthy food and fresh water. In the second category of protection were carpenters, tailors, conflict mediators, and first responders, those who kept bodies and spaces safe. The third category, information, included teachers, journalists, artists, religious leaders, and other messengers for a better life. Healing included doctors, nurses, therapists, and dietitians, and those of a similar ilk. In the fifth category, restoration, were sanitation workers, morticians, barbers, and providers of environmental cleanup and disaster relief. Those who transformed disorder into order for general well-being and health. Many in the group decided to adopt new careers in the life-giving fields with less regard for income and wealth. Where a need existed, they would serve generously. Reciprocity was entrusted to the instructions woven into the web of life and love in God's economy of Jubilee. This was, after all, the underlying logic of an unregulated free market. Where needs existed, there would be demand. If supply was fulfilled, adequate compensation would be provided. Such compensation, the friends were fully aware, would not magically appear. Money does not grow on trees, was a childhood lesson they often heard and remembered still. Therefore, total expenses were tallied, every dollar spent, for a year of life and work. The accounting was shared transparently and discussed without pride, shame, or hesitance. They helped each other find the way to lower expenses, lower incomes, and break the addiction to money and wealth. With the groundwork in their budgets laid and their work reoriented towards care, the gatherings began to consider where to go from there. As word spread of the benefits of reoriented relationships with work and income, the gatherings expanded to include families, co-workers, and friends. So much so, in fact, to maintain trust and familiarity, the multicellular groups had to divide and multiply like the mitosis of single cells. The new gatherings proposed to organize into associations, to more fully integrate their interactions with the principles of life and love. In the marrow of their bones, at a cellular level, they knew the synergy of cooperation and symbiosis would outcompete the novel trends of individualism, selfishness, and fear. The new entities drew on conventional forms. They were modeled after neighborhood associations, communities of faith, corporations, counties, states, and nations. The first was called the Church of the Emancipation, though it was quite unlike any of its namesake before. Participants in the new associations embodied in life, work, rest, and play, life and love's universal ethic of care. All members and participants agreed to offer their work to the best of their ability and to consume only what they needed. They cared well for themselves and their dependents while minimizing income and expenses. Revenues were collected and dispersed in such a way that everyone's varying needs were completely met and no one's were exceeded. If total revenues fell short of the necessary minimum, incomes were divided equally. Then came yet another break with tradition. They informed their customers of the actual costs of products and services rendered. Decisions of how much to pay were left to the well-informed customers. After all, the customers were the true employers. They paid the employees' actual wages. The owner-employers who for so long had dictated prices to customers and wages to employees were merely middlemen. They had been ascribed the power to rob Peter in order to pay Paul. In the process, they pocketed more than a little silver for themselves. Informed and empowered customers with sufficient means were entrusted to cover the break-even costs to keep services sustainable. Those with incomes below the median could give what was affordable. Customers with incomes above the median, or surplus savings on hand, could opt to pay above the break-even to cover the difference. Everyone looked forward to the day when no one was asked to give more because others had so little. Contributions were accepted anonymously, revenues monitored collectively. In this way, no one felt any embarrassment of poverty, nor, due to their wealth, felt entitled to special privileges. Everyone's needs, regardless of age, ability, or poverty, were met unconditionally. To Economicus, allowing customers to decide how much to pay seemed irrational and unsustainable. Such a concept must surely fail. Humans, they believed, were thoroughly self-interested, lazy, and unmotivated except by greed or fear. If given half a chance, humans as customers were innately prone to steal. Economicus's views on human nature may have been a projection of their own shallow self-image. As it turned out, most of Sapiens' offsprings were trustworthy, responsible, and fair. Within themselves, most perceived these traits. They hoped neighbors experienced them as such as well. Their true motivations were so intrinsic, they often went unnoticed and unstated. Once again, like water to the fish, or the forest to a tree. All who wished to join the emergent associations were welcomed upon request. As they caught the gist of what was being asked to reorganize their lives, all participants were slowly integrated. No one was excluded or disqualified. Antiquated concepts now rendered obsolete. In the meantime, variance was accepted, even necessary within degrees, while everyone worked towards a common trajectory. In order to implement such unconventional ideas in a hostile economy and release the psychological baggage of intergenerational inequality, participants put forth the effort to develop and maintain familial intimacy and trust. In the early days of Sabbath, the methods were deceptively simple. They gathered together religiously, come rain or shine, for conversation, spiritual practice, and play. Only later did they develop the rules of order to function as a cooperative entity. Once the declaration, with a capital D, was made, the initial order of business, the preamble, with a capital P, if you will, emphasized above all else the care of children, elders, and dependents. No longer would families have to first receive an employer's begrudging permission to render care to a loved one in need. No longer would incomes, lives, or livelihoods be placed in jeopardy. From that time forward, the balance of power did shift. Life and love was once again the center of gravity. Commerce was but a small moon held in its proper orbit. Parents of young children, like adult children of elder parents, asked each other, What from me do you need today? In tandem, family members determined what amount of time would be beneficial to spend together and apart. Throughout the long cycle of the years of a life, families followed patterns like the seasons. For instance, in a child's earliest years, parents stayed with their children based on the level of their needs and dependency. Likewise, in an elder's later years, adult children were available to care for their parents. Like the solstices, when days are very long and nights very short, time together was prioritized over time apart. In the decades between life's solstices, parents, children, and grandparents allowed their time together and apart to gradually move towards balance, just as days move towards the equinox. Time apart matched time together to everyone's needs for independence and presence were equally and easily met. No one felt neglected or overworked. In midlife, from a balanced center, children, parents, and grandparents had optimum flexibility to meet the needs of their family as well as their community. Then, just as equinox yields to the next approaching solstice, time for adult children with elder parents gravitated towards togetherness. As with the cycles of seasons, so too in the endless ebb and flow of presence and care. As associations like the Church of the Emancipation evolved, participants moved beyond the fundamentals of a preamble. They developed a new constitution, capital C, akin to a rule of life. If newly embodied entities were to converge to achieve symbiosis in the near term, to maintain homeostasis over the long run, and adaptively evolve in perpetuity, everyone agreed the Constitution must mimic life and love's instructions echoing through the universe. The new Constitution harkened back to the universal ethic of care and the early days of good governance. It was kept brief, simple, and flexible. Themes of harmlessness, inclusion, and restoration were its emphasis. Liberty and latitude were enabled by the responsible behavior, self-restraint, and mutual trust of each participant. Divergent ideas, people, and groups would exist together until distinctions faded and gradually reblended into one. In the interim, disagreements and conflict were presumed. If someone's poor choice led to another person's harm, the former seized the first opportunity to repair the damage done. In response to one person's pain, no one else was hurt, humiliated, or harmed. The community did not model behavior they wished to deter. Everyone among them was assumed to want to do what was good and right. No one was treated as if they held an innate, irresistible urge to cause harm. If, on a second occasion, another poor choice was made, an informal intervention was carried forth. As a jury of one's peers, the intervention was led by two neighbors. One was a person who loved and cared for the offender. The second was the person, or as the case may be, persons, who experienced the harm. The loved one informed the offender of the purpose of the rule. Their neighbor informed them of what happened when it was broken. Consensus was reached on appropriate repairs, which the offender expeditiously completed. When errors were made repeatedly, or when the harm was severe, the community intervened. Options were available from which to choose. One option applied to those who neglected to perform an act which was required. They were sentenced to an immersion experience to learn firsthand the rule's beneficent purpose. Another option applied to those who repeated an act explicitly forbidden. For a period of time, they were sequestered away from the community. During the time of separation, appropriate daily practices of care were performed to expedite reunification. Lastly, if multiple people violated a rule, or if the violations formed a pattern, scrutiny was applied to the rule. In this way, the community could discern if the rule had achieved obsolescence, or if its enforcement was selectively uneven. When the Constitution was implemented, participants found a surprise. With less fear and less shame, adults and children had less urge to speak defensively, less incentive to lie. They felt safe to be vulnerably honest and discuss the choices made. In small circles of truth and reconciliation, hearts and minds were healed, spiritual wounds forgiven. The sense of safety, if it wavered, was quickly and easily restored. Associations of associations had converged to form communities to live within the universal ethic of care. They committed to organize for the equitable provision of material, energy, and work, to care well for elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin. Vocations were chosen to feed, protect, teach, heal, and restore. Everyone was unconditionally cared for. Well-informed customers, comparing their budgets with those of their providers, determined the cost of care. Providers agreed to lower expenses, lower incomes, and to avoid accumulated wealth. Revenues were divided so everyone's modest needs were completely met. If revenues fell short of the threshold, incomes were divided among them equally. As the instructions conveyed from the tiny mustard seed were integrated more fully, participants came to trust each other and the web of life and love. Fearlessly, well nurtured in security, they flourished. Before Sapiens' offspring could be fully liberated and reconciled, one last endeavor lay ahead. By this stage in their evolution, the next step was so plainly obvious, debate and contemplation were unnecessary. To Economicus and the Euro-Americans, on the other hand, the next step would have seemed the most radical, the most irrational of all. From the systems of wealth, poverty, and inequality, participants exercised the option to divest. For the sake of emancipation, they assigned their homes to a trust. Emancipated homes were exchanged from one occupant to the next for the minimal costs of transfer. Homes were occupied and well cared for, but rented or sold for profit, nevermore. Neighbors were no longer to be enslaved by decades of debt for permission to occupy the fundamental necessity of a home. Any wealth, also known as equity, entitled to a deed of permission to the occupant had long been accounted as useless, a psychological gimmick, an entry on a balance sheet, pixels on a screen, like sand in an hourglass or castles on the beach. Concurrently, more liquid forms of wealth were redistributed to those with greater needs. The holders of stock, keepers of bonds, and hoarders of cash gradually reduced savings down to the community's median. Some manumitted their wealth at the time of death through their last will and testament, just as their half-hearted slave-holding ancestors had done. Those of a more abolitionist strand scoffed at the selfish cowardice. They freed themselves and their surplus wealth as quickly as they could. Emancipation and equality were long overdue. Further delay was simply unacceptable. While these events were occurring, as one might suspect, the free market did not go quietly. Euro-Americans and Economicus held firm beliefs in the outstretched invisible hand of their dynamic pyramid. It had become a symbol by which to orient one's life as one would with any object of worship or devotion. Their economic model had infiltrated their minds like a belief or identity, as an addiction not easily surrendered. With Euro-Americans and Economicus' faith so deeply entrenched, they were doggedly determined. With the aperture of heart and mind so nearly closed, imaginations had withered. They were fearful of anything other than the dynamic scheme of inequality and suffering. They made it widely known. They were willing to die, a euphemism for willing to kill, in order to sustain it. Violence had become a means of nobility to hoard their contrived superiority. In their self-image, such strength and conviction made them look and feel better than everyone else. This was the myth of Narcissus, stoked to pure whiteness. Fortunately, a remnant had long kept hope alive. The web of life and love was never meant to be owned and withheld, tortured and abused, ransomed and consumed so destructively. By this time, the majority agreed. Humanity's perennial goal was to lower the median income towards zero. Though absolute accomplishment was mathematically impossible, this was the trajectory to perpetually strive in order to heal the addiction to insidious greed. This meant, of course, that the half who lived above the medians in income and wealth were expected to strive for less. As the community's median declined, everyone celebrated the good news. With the arrival of Jubilee, the wealthiest had no use for money, and the weakest were those who needed so much more than everyone else. In this context, everyone, elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, could flourish forevermore. An era arrived when Sapiens' youngest offspring, our greatest great-grandchildren, looked back at the behaviors of their ancestors in stunned disbelief. This is a quote. How could they have tolerated, much less believed, in the contradictory propaganda of rational self-interest, scarcity, accumulation of wealth, unlimited growth, and unequal prosperity? Close quote. Thankfully, the offspring had come to universally agree in a far more reasonable, sober idea, to meet in the middle, to strive for equality. Jubilee was neither utopia nor a panacea, nor would it ever be. Intrinsic to creative divergence and the freedom to choose, dilemmas and conflicts continued. No longer, however, did humans use the power of inequality in the forms of privilege, violence, neglect, or fear to achieve narrow-minded, selfish ends. Instead, conflicts were approached with curiosity and resolved with words and cooperative actions. Unpleasant stresses simply indicated an imbalance. An event had occurred outside of predictions or mutual reciprocity. To remain within the ethical thresholds of homeostasis, imbalances were forthrightly addressed. At the points of inflection, there may be a strain, a shudder, a slowing, before the flowing equilibrium of interdependence was restored. And so it was. Elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin all remained safe, healthy, and content. Shalom was the eternal norm. Continuity in the midst of change reigned in perpetuity. The universe continued to respire, expand, contract, like spirit, like seasons, like breath. The web of life and love on the planet now known as Earth was at one once again. Jubilee, as it turns out, is an original story without beginning or end. So concludes the 6th chapter. I look forward to reading the 7th chapter to you soon. Thank you again for being here. Much love to you.